Hello and welcome to this installment of Bio 153. In this unit, we will be talking about metabolism. And in this video, we're going to be talking about fed and fasted state metabolism. Okay, so we just finished our digestion unit in which we talked about how we break down various molecules and absorb them into our bodies. In this unit, we are going to talk about what happens to those molecules once they enter our bodies. Okay, so ingested molecules have kind of three main fates after entering our bodies. The first is energy, right? So we can take those molecules and break them down in order to synthesize ATP. Another fate is synthesis, right? So as we take in some molecules, we can use them as building blocks to make parts of our cells, such as membranes, proteins that carry out various functions in the cell, and so on. And then if we have extra, we can convert them into like kind of a more compact form and store them somewhere in our body for later use. Okay, so those are the three main things that are going to happen to the molecules that we ingest. Our metabolic pathways, or the way that we process our nutrient molecules, can be separated into two broad categories: anabolic versus catabolic. In anabolic pathways, larger molecules are synthesized from smaller molecules. Okay, so here is an example of an anabolic pathway. We are taking glycerol and fatty acids and combining them to make this larger molecule, a triglyceride. Okay. In catabolic pathways, what we do is the opposite. We take larger molecules and we break them down into smaller molecules. So in this example, we are taking glycogen, which is a polymer of glucose, and we are breaking it down into its individual glucose subunits. Okay, so those are our examples of anabolic versus catabolic pathways. At any given time, our body can be described as being in either of two main metabolic states. Okay, the first of those states is the fed state, or the absorptive state. Okay, the absorptive state happens after a meal. Okay, so it's basically after we've been fed. We have a bunch of nutrients available in our bodies, in our bloodstreams. We have a bunch of stuff that has been absorbed. Okay, so during this state, what we do is we absorb nutrients, we use them right away in our cells, or we store them away in somewhere in our bodies. Okay, so basically these are anabolic processes that happen in the fed state. Our other state of metabolism is the fasted state, or the post-absorptive state. So this is going to be between meals when blood nutrient levels fall. And what happens here is since it's been a while since we've absorbed nutrients, our blood nutrient levels fall. And then what we do is we tap into those nutrients that we stored earlier during the fed state, and we break them down to free them up for use around the body, because the body, still has a demand for these nutrients. Okay, so these are catabolic pathways that are going to be happening in the fasted or the post-absorptive state. All right, so now let's go through the fates of our various molecule types in the fed state, and then we're going to talk about what happens to them in the fasted state. Okay, so we're going to start with carbohydrates. We're going to take a look at what happens with carbohydrates in the fed state. Most of our carbohydrates, so this is our, our digestive system. This is where we're taking in our carbohydrates. What happens to most of our carbohydrates after we absorb them is that they get used right away for energy in our tissues. Okay, so they just get spread all over in the bloodstream. They get taken up by the individual cells. to be used for energy. So remember that glucose can be broken down by the process of glycolysis and possibly the citric acid cycle, depending on whether oxygen is available or not. But the kind of the end product of that is ATP, which is what the cells are gonna be using for energy. Okay, so that's what happens to most of the carbohydrates right after we eat them. If we have extra, that's going to get stored. So first, those carbohydrates, remember that they have been um, ingested or absorbed in the form of monosaccharides. So they're going to go to the liver to be converted either to glycogen or fat, and then they're going to be stored. Okay, so glycogen gets stored in the liver, fat gets stored in fat tissue, also known as adipose tissue. Okay, let's take a quick look at these processes of glycogen, the making of glycogen, and the making of fat. Okay, so glycogen, as I mentioned before, it's a polymer of glucose. So basically, the way you make glycogen is you have an enzyme that's going to take the individual glucose molecules and string them together. Okay, I want to kind of draw your attention to this terminology here. So, looking at word roots, genesis means making. So glycogenesis is going to be the making of glycogen. Okay, so that's basically all I'm going to say about glycogenesis. Glycogen, as I mentioned before, after it's made, it's going to be stored in the liver, and it's also going to be stored in the muscle. Okay, taking a look at the synthesis of fats. So again, looking at word roots, we have genesis, which means the making, right? And lipo means fat. So lipogenesis is going to be the making of fat. How do we do this? Basically, what happens is, as you know, we're starting with carbohydrates. Remember that we're talking about the fate of carbohydrates during the fed state. Okay, so we're starting with carbohydrates. Glycerol can be made out of glycolysis, from glycolysis. Okay, and then we can take acetyl coenzyme A and convert that to fatty acids. Then we can combine our glycerol and our fatty acids to make our triglycerides. Okay, so that's how we make our fats. And then I want to remind you that fats are stored in adipose tissue. Quick question for you. Is this process anabolic or catabolic? Take a quick look, think about that for a second. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that's anabolic. We are taking smaller molecules and building them into larger molecules.